Okay, so we're going to talk about section 3.3. This section's about fractions, decimals, and percents, and so I've written a rule up here on the board that I want you to be aware of, and this is showing you, the top one shows you that if we're going from a percent to a decimal, you're going to need to move the decimal place 2 places to the left. If you're going from a decimal back to a percent, you're going to move it 2 places to the right. So that's something that you need to hang on to as we move through this lesson. All right, so our first example is going to be a problem that we have that is, let me look here, 25%. Okay, if we write 25% as a decimal, well, what does it look like? Anytime that you have a percent sign, it means that it's going to be out of 100, okay? And what you see is actually your numerator. And so this seems fairly simple, except we have to remember that we have to simplify by dividing the top and bottom by a common number. So we can first divide by 5 if you want to, and we end up with 5/20. We see that we can actually divide by 5 again, and on top and bottom, and we end up with a final answer of 1/4, if I can get that right here. 1/4 will be my final answer for this problem. Now I want you to see just for a second that if you started with this problem right here and you divided the top and bottom and you knew that 25 went evenly into both of them, you could have done that same thing right there and skipped this middle step right here if you would have divided at first by the biggest number that could go into them. So what are we doing today? Well, we're taking what they give us as a starting point, and so in this problem they started with 25%. They wanted all 3 of the things that we talked about this section's about. They want a fraction, they want a decimal, and they want a percent. And they're going to give us one of them and try to make us find the other 2. So for this one they found a percent. We just found a fraction, so now we need a decimal for our final answer here. So we started here. Here's our first answer, and our second answer is going to be a decimal. So to find a decimal, remember that our fraction is actually a division problem, so it's the same thing as 1 divided by 4. So when you put that into your calculator, it does just spit out a beautiful little decimal for you. Okay, so let's try another one. Let's kind of help make this all make sense for us. Our starting point is going to be 46%. All right, remember that the percent sign tells us it's going to be out of 100. That is always the case, no matter how big or how ugly that top number is, but this whole number here is. It's always going to be your top number, but the bottom number, if there's a percent sign beside it, is always going to be a denominator of 100. So my top number is the percent that you see is 46. The percent tells me denominator of 100. This is my answer for the fraction unless it can be simplified, and it actually can be simplified. So we know that they're both even numbers, so we're going to start dividing by 2. And we'll keep dividing by 2 until we can't divide by anything anymore. So if I divide this, I end up with 23/50. And right here I know that 23 doesn't simplify anymore, so this is my answer. So my starting point was 1, my first answer is 2, and my third answer is the third piece. Remember, they come in 3s, percent, fraction, decimal. We have to have all 3 of them involved in the problem. So the third one is going to be a decimal. Okay, and so this decimal is going to be found by taking the fraction that we just found and making it into a division problem. We read from top to bottom, so we have 23 divided by 50. Why are we using a divide sign? Because that right there means divide. So I put that into my calculator, and it spits out a fraction of 0.46. So I also want to point out to you that you can take a decimal and a percent, and you can go back and forth between the 2 of them without actually needing that third piece because of these rules right here. And so remember I told you that if you have a percent to get to a decimal, you just take the number and you move the decimal place over 2 places to the left. If you have a decimal moving to a percent, you move 2 decimals to the right. So let's go back and look at this. So remember I just told you that we can go straight from here to the decimal, which makes sense because I see 25% and 0.25. The number 25 is there in both of them. And so if 25 is a whole number, right? My decimal is assumed to be right here. If I'm going to go from a percent, which I am, to a decimal, I know I go to the left 2 places, My new decimal is here, which is how come we have this answer right here. Okay, so let's try our other one. So I have 46%. My decimal is understood to be here because it's a whole number. It's behind the whole number. And if it's behind the whole number, you don't have to put it. It just represents, it's just understood to be there. And so remember, from a percent to a decimal, we go 2 places to the left, and that's how we got the decimal to be in front of the 4. Okay? All right, let's look at another one. Instead of starting with a percent, we're now going to start with a fraction. Okay? So I don't have a denominator of 100, so it doesn't look like a percent like we've been talking about. So I need to move right along here in the only way that I know how. I know that I'm going to need a decimal, and I know that I will need a percent. The decimal is going to be fairly easy because I just use my calculator. I take the fraction that I have, I put it in my calculator, and I end up with a decimal. When I type this in and push enter, I end up with this as a decimal. Oops, sorry, 72, not 27. So this is my second, or my first answer, I guess, of the 3. So here's 1, here's 2. The last one is going to be a percent. And it's really easy to go from a decimal to a percent. We've been going from a percent to a decimal, and we've been moving our decimal to the left. Now we're going to move from a decimal back to a percent, so we're going to move our decimal 2 places to the right. If you're not sure, go back to that first page of notes that I gave you, see where you're starting, what you have, and then just follow the rule. Okay? This is a good thing to put in your notes for your note card for you on the test if you can't keep this straight. So now I have a decimal and I'm moving to a percent, so I'm going to the right 2 places. And so that's why, whoops, sorry, right here, I went 2 places to the right. And when I do that, the decimal goes behind the 2, and so this is the percent that I have. So these are my 2 answers for this problem. The 0.72 decimal and 72% for this one. What happens if we start with a decimal? Well, we know that if I take the decimal and I move it 2 places to the right, 1, 2, I can find a percent. Why is it 30? Because this is a blank, right? I need a placeholder for that. So I started with 0.3. I moved it 1, 2, and remember, we're not counting right here. We're not actually counting the numbers. We're counting the places between the numbers, which means that's where the decimal could go. So I started here and I went 1, 2, and now I left my decimal behind there. That's how we're counting this. All right, so from a percent to a fraction, I have 30, and I told you that anytime you see a percent, it tells you out of 100. I simplify this by dividing the top and bottom by 10. And I end up with 3/10. So 0.3 and 30% and 3/10 are all equal. They're all equivalent. They are all the same. All right, let's try, let's see. On your homework, you're going to be asked to add or subtract a fraction and a decimal. Okay? For this homework, you're going to need to be able to put them both into the same form. I would say that the easiest way to do this is to put them both into decimal form, but I actually know that my open math is going to ask you for your final answer to be as a fraction. So it's actually going to be better for you to know how to change these to fractions, and to solve this is a little bit easier. But let me show you, if you wanted these both to be decimals, you would treat this as a division problem, get another decimal, and then you would add the 2 decimals together using your calculator. Or you could do it by paper, and remember that the rule is if you're adding or subtracting decimals, you're going to line them up, and you're going to add and bring your decimal straight down, okay? But if you're not going to, and we're going to keep it in fraction form, I know that this one is going to be a fraction, and I need this one to also be a fraction. I want you to see here, what do I have? I have 1. What place value is it? It's tenths, and so 1 over 10. We learned this in 3.1, I believe, maybe 3.2. So here I need to add them, and anytime I add and subtract, I need a common denominator, so I multiply them both together and I get 90 as a new common denominator. I multiply in the diagonal from bottom to top and I get 9, I multiply in bottom to top and I get 70. So I add across the top and I get 79 over 90. For this one, I cannot simplify at all by dividing by anything, so I'm going to call 79/90ths my final answer. So for your homework, it's going to ask you to add these two together and to submit your final answer in fraction form. I actually have a paper. Let me read it to you and tell you what it says. If I can find it. Okay, I can't find it. We'll just move on. All right, we're going to toggle back and forth. They're going to give you a percent, ask for a decimal, give you a decimal, ask for a percent. So we've already done examples to that. If they want a fraction to go from a fraction to a percent, you can do that, but you need to figure out what it is as a decimal before you can move it to a percent. So if it asks for a fraction, and they want you to go to a percent, you need to know what the decimal is first, because you can't move from a fraction to a percent. You have to have the decimal to a percent, or percent to a decimal. So for us to do this, we're going to take 17 divided by 50. When I do that, I find it to be 0.34. And so now I have 0.34, and I know how to move it to a percent. I just move it 2 places to the right, and I find this to be 34%. Final answer. So if they ask for a fraction to a percent, you can't do it. You have to divide and change your fraction into a decimal, and then move your decimal to a percent. All right, so this last part is maybe the most difficult part of our lesson, but I want to make sure that I am giving you some good examples for us to practice on. So before I do this, I'm going to write out some of this, and our first thing that I want you to see, are going to be the rules. And so the word is the same thing as equals. The word of is the same thing as multiply. What number is going to be used in the problem, and we're going to call it n as our variable or our unknown, and what percent is going to be represented as p. And remember, if you ever use a percent, we have to move the decimal. All right, so those are your rules, and we're going to switch back to a different screen, and I'm going to give you an example problem here. All right, so our first problem says, probably should have typed this too, what is 40% of 250? Okay, so we're going to use this up here to put together an equation from exactly what is listed. So what is 40%? So I have a percent of 250. 250 is the number that they were given to us. So let's start here. Is an equal sign. Of means multiply. It tells me that a number, well, I don't have just a plain number, right? I have a percent here. The number I have is actually a whole number, okay, of like a part of it, a whole. And so this right here is going to be what I don't know. So this unknown here. And my percent, I have to change to a decimal. So if I move it 2 places to the right, I end up with 0.40. I write down my 250, and look at this. I now have an equation that I can use for this. Oops, sorry. And so I have n is equal to 0.40 times 250. So I will just type in 0.40, 0.40 times 250 in my calculator and push equal, and I find n is equal to 100. So 100 is 40% of 250. How did I do this? I used the rules up here and literally just plugged them in. I did not rearrange them. I did not mix them up. I just plugged them in based on the words that were in that problem. Okay, let's try another one. Let me drag this over. Okay. All right, our next problem is going to be what is 60% of 280? That is not what I just did. Okay, no. All right, so what is something I don't know? I don't know if it's a number or percent until I read this a little bit further, but I do know that is my equal sign. Percent means I'm going to have to change this to a decimal, so I move it back the other way. So 0.60. Of is my multiply sign. 280 is the number. And so what have I not used? I've used percent, I've used multiply, I've used is, so in is what I don't know. And so in, something I don't know, is equal to 0.60 times 280. So I type in this guy right here in my calculator, 0.60. I literally type it in just like that. Push the multiply sign, the X or the dot, and then type in 280, push equals, and I find n is equal to, that would be great if I had my calculator. Sorry. 0.60 times 280 equals 168. Final answer. Okay. It's possible that they may ask you for things that are in kind of a different order, so we're going to look at another problem right here. I'm going to type it out because it is a word problem, so I want you to kind of follow along with this to help it make sense for you. It says, at a restaurant, the bill is, $60. If you decide to leave a 16% tip, all right, so here it is. You are at a restaurant, you have a bill of $60, you're leaving a not top, but tip. You're leaving a tip. How much is the tip? Well, this is the same thing of what we've been doing, okay? We know that we have n is equal to the percent times the whole, right? That's what we've been doing. The whole number has been the number, the 280 or the 250 in the other problems. And so this is how this problem is always set up. N, a part of something, is equal to the percent times the whole dollar amount. In this case, it's dollars. So what we're doing is we're going to plug in what we know. And so the bill is my whole, right? That's how much I have. Percent I'm trying to tip is going to be 16%. And I want you to see that 16% is the same thing as 0.16. Anytime that I plug it into an equation, I have to use the decimal. And I'm trying to find how much the tip is. And n is going to be my tip. Okay, so if I type in 0.16 times 60 into my calculator, I find that I have to leave a $9.60 tip if I'm tipping 16% and my bill is $60. What if this problem didn't ask you for how much the tip was, but they asked you what your total bill was? Okay, $9.60 is actually my tip. My bill was $60. So my total, right, they have all the items and all your prices up here. They give you a total on your bill. They have a tip line and then they have a total line. Well, now your $9.60 is your tip. So your total comes from being able to add these two items together. And so $69.60. How do I know that? Because remember that you add up, you line up the decimals. So here's my decimals. I bring the decimal down and I add. And that's how I got $69.60 as my final total bill. Total is going to be adding up the tip and the total price of your bill. Okay. Let's try one more. What is 70% of 210 is what number? Okay, so they rearrange things. But it doesn't matter. They want you to solve the problem in the exact same order that you see. We know of is a decimal, is an equal sign, what number is something I don't know, 210 is my whole, and 70 as a decimal is my part. So remember just a second ago I wrote this for you. N is equal to percent times the whole. Now it's percent times the whole is equal to N. It's the same thing. I want you to see that they're on, the percent and whole are always on the same side together, and the N is on the other side. So they just kind of flip this around, but it is the same thing. So I don't want you to get discouraged or feel like you're not knowing what you're doing. Just make sure that you are solving it exactly like you see it. Of is here, my percent is here, I bring it down to 10, is my equal, and there's my thing, my unknown. So you just put it all exactly where it goes. Don't rearrange things. So 0.70 times 210 is equal to 147, final answer. Okay. All right, that is it for section 3.3. Make sure that you take care of your TOEICs and bring them to class.